thinking back over the years of the history of Bible translation, um, what were the earliest attempts to translate the Bible out of its, original languages, even into English, but especially English. But how did that process begin? When did people kind of really look at the text and think, okay, we got to start translating this so that people can read it in their own language? Or what were some of the major milestones there?
Well, it started very, very early indeed, right back into the biblical period itself. For instance, many of the Jewish people at the time of Christ were losing their ability to speak Hebrew, and so Aramaic paraphrases of the Old Testament began to be used and became widely available because people were speaking Aramaic. That was their native language. They didn't understand Hebrew as well anymore. So right from the beginning, there has been concern to put the Word of God into languages that people were actually using and could understand. That happened for the Christian Bible, of course, very early as well, into Latin and Syriac and various other languages in the early centuries of the Christian church.
Mm-hmm. And am I right in saying that English was quite a bit behind some of those other translations, especially Latin?
Well, yeah, English just didn't arise as a significant language until later in history. And so it was particularly Wycliffe in the 1300s who did an initial translation into English, but it was the twin twin focal points of the Reformation, emphasis on the Word of God, and the invention of the printing press that particularly sparked the interest in translation, because then, now suddenly you have the ability to translate a Bible into languages, to print it and distribute it widely in a way that was never possible before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly something that we take for granted these days, just having
Sure.
the Bible in our own language. And last year I kind of I did a year as a history teacher in a high school, and we were talking about the Reformation, and I think my eyes were opened a lot about some of these characters, especially Wycliffe, but the people that really risked everything to bring the language to the reader's own language and not just in Latin. And what are some of the benefits of having it in that language rather than having the priests or the clergy trying to interpret it in your eyes?
Well, again, it was a fundamental principle of the Reformation, of course, to emphasize what they called the priesthood of all believers, that every Christian has access to God, to knowing God. They don't have to go through the clergy in order to know God. And as Latin became sort of enshrined as the language of the church, that was not the language of the people. Many didn't even understand it, so they had no real access to the Word of God. Reformers, again, really wanted to change that, and so they began producing versions, Luther in German, for instance, Tyndale in English, and in many other languages at the same time.
Yeah, it's like bringing some democracy to the whole their whole Christian walk, I suppose. And
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, was it often abused by those priests who could speak Latin, or I've always wondered from a historical perspective, has it been almost exaggerated how much abuse there was, or I wonder, was the average priest reasonably faithful to the Latin text? Is that something you've looked into at all?
No, I can't say that I have very much. And obviously, in any group of people, you're going to have some who don't have the greatest motives in the world, but others who do. And so I suspect many of the Roman Catholic priests at the time of Luther and Calvin were faithfully doing what they understood they needed to do, and to conduct Mass in Latin, for instance, feeling that was of benefit to the people, even if the people didn't understand it. The Reformers obviously had a different view.
Yeah, for sure. And looking back at some of those early translations, the philosophy, I assume, has changed over the years, and we have a variety of different translations today. Whereas obviously back then they had, I guess, maybe one, possibly two translations from that language into English or German or those kind of languages. In the early days, were the early translations relatively faithful to the original texts, or I wonder how much we've developed over the years from those guys, people like Martin Luther and Wycliffe. when we look back at those older translations, how close were they and how good were they as translations?
Well, again, it varied, of course. A number of translations were made back in those days, but Luther's German Bible, Tyndale's New Testament, the Geneva Bible, others that arose in the 1500s were generally quite good. People knew the languages. They tried to put it into good English. Tyndale himself had the principle that he wanted to translate the Bible so that the merest plowboy could read it, was, I think, his language. And that kind of enshrined one of the concerns for those early translators, which I think spills over into modern translation philosophy as well, that to put the Bible into the words that people are actually using, into words that they can understand and appreciate.